When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement did. I don't really know why. Most people are more afraid of basements, but there was something about our attic that really got to me. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you're probably picturing. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are typically cramped and congested, which makes sense, but our attic was built in such a way that you didn't ever have to crouch when you were up there. You might think that would imply we used it more often, the same way anyone would use excess space. But no, I'm not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided it as much as possible. The other thing about it was that it had so many nooks and crannies built into it. What I mean by that is the space was broken up by odd beams and small changes in elevation, almost like a makeshift maze. The beams were of uneven thickness, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. The result was that you couldn't stand in any one place up there and have a clear line of sight from one end to the other, and the uneven flooring was a nightmare. You could genuinely injure yourself up there if you weren't careful. And my dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on one of the joists, fall through the insulation, and puncture a hole in the ceiling. So you can imagine why an attic like that would be scary to a little kid. The maze-like quality was what freaked me out the most. I really didn't like not being able to see the attic in its entirety, and every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of the beams. But anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't have a ton of other memories from that period in my life. For whatever reason, however, this memory is so vivid that it feels like a thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic childhood. It happened during the week, which I remember because I had school that day. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of grit between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd just gone to bed, fallen asleep, and woken up with filthy feet. Being a little kid and all, I didn't give it too much thought beyond that. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and went about my day. Things only escalated from there though. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was this small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs, and when I asked my mom about it, she just assumed I'd been rummaging through the attic for some reason. I told her I hadn't, but she didn't seem concerned. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was that. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing that I vaguely recognized from the attic. This time I was sure I definitely hadn't brought that down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through my house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it belonged there. That's when things started clicking into place. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me right away, but it made me feel strange. The idea that I was unconsciously navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in the dark, completely unaware of what I was doing, was weird. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I'd probably grow out of it. I wouldn't exactly say they were dismissive, but they weren't overly concerned either. To them, it was just one of those things. But to me, it was more than that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie in bed for hours after I was supposed to go to sleep, fighting it because I was terrified of what might happen once I was unconscious. I obviously couldn't fight sleep forever though, and every morning, I would frantically check my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, but those few times they weren't really got to me. There was no denying that I was definitely going up to the attic regularly, and the worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending more time up there than in my own bed. The fear I felt during that period was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was like this slow, creeping dread that never went away. It was awful, but nothing was scarier than what I'm about to say. I woke up one morning, Only it wasn't morning. It was still dark out. It took me a few seconds to realize it, but I wasn't in my bed either. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I registered. I was standing upright in complete darkness, and I had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even process it. But then the recognition hit me. I was in the attic. The fear that washed over me was so intense that I almost couldn't breathe. I was in the attic in the middle of the night in pitch black darkness. I couldn't see a single thing, not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch, nothing. Just absolute impenetrable black. And to make matters worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. It was like sleep paralysis times 100. I knew the layout of the attic, but only vaguely and only from memory. I also knew there were obstacles everywhere. The idea of trying to find my way back to the hatch in complete darkness was almost unthinkable, but I couldn't just stand there forever. So I started moving, slowly and painfully. I was so scared that I actually started crying, but silently. The tears were just flooding down my face, and I felt like if I made too much noise, something was going to get me. It was the most terrified I've ever been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I don't know what was giving me that thought, but I could feel something else there with me, something further in the dark, and as soon as I had that thought, I actually heard something. There was a soft thud from somewhere behind me. It honestly sounded like a footstep or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I kept moving, but I heard the sound twice more, and both times it sounded like it was coming from a different spot. At that point, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was something else up there with me. I don't know how long it took me to find the hatch, but I eventually did find it. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up. I was full on bawling at that point. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them what had happened, how I'd had to find my way back in the dark. I told them about the sounds too, and that there was someone in the attic. I expected my dad to spring out of bed and rush up there with a baseball bat, but he didn't. They didn't even really take me seriously. My mom just hugged me and told me it was okay, that sleepwalking could be scary, but it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch if it would make me feel better, and I said yes, obviously. But I knew what I heard. I insisted that they at least check the attic, and my dad finally agreed. As I was watching my dad climb up there was a part of me that genuinely thought he wasn't going to make it back. But not 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the ladder. He told me there was nothing up there and to go back to sleep. So that's what I did, but lying in bed after that experience was the worst night of my life. After that, the sleepwalking did stop. I'm not sure what I would have done if it had continued, and speaking of that, I've never been able to fully accept the sleepwalking explanation. I know that's the most logical explanation. Sleepwalking is a real thing that happens to people, and there's nothing supernatural about it. But there's this part of me that can't let it go. The way I always ended up in the same place, the attic, never anywhere else in the house, and the way I was apparently capable of navigating the maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without even hurting myself. And most of all, that night I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard, I still believe there was something up there with me, I really do. What it was, I have no idea. I'm obviously a lot older now, and I've brought these concerns up to my parents several times, but they always give me the same dismissive answers. It almost feels like they themselves don't want to think about it, which also doesn't make much sense to me. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. This happened when I was 14 or 15. My family lived in this old house that had been passed down for generations. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him. I don't live there anymore, but I still think about what I'm about to tell you from time to time. Like most houses, it had an attic. It was basically a graveyard for stuff nobody wanted to deal with, like old furniture, boxes of God knows what, and Christmas decorations. That last one was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year right before the holidays, and then once more to put everything back. This happened around Christmas time, but Christmas has basically nothing to do with the story. That particular Christmas, my dad decided I was finally old enough to grab the decorations myself. He gave me the whole rundown, which boxes to look for, something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall, and I nodded along like I was paying attention. I wasn't, not really. I was thinking about something else. We finished talking and he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the ladder and pulled down the little chain to turn on the light. I remember looking around and thinking I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. But then I realized there was a problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had actually told me to grab. I couldn't remember any of his instructions, and there was no way I was going back to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. He'd get legitimately pissed off if you made him say something twice, so I just started opening random boxes that looked like they might contain Christmas decorations. I moved stuff around for probably 20 minutes, and I ended up making a complete mess of the place. I did eventually find the Christmas stuff, which spared me the anxiety of having to go back downstairs empty-handed, but the attic was completely disorganized at that point. I made like 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, hauling everything to the living room. Once I was done, I went back up for one last look to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. I knew I was going to have to reorganize everything up there, which I wasn't looking forward to. As I was looking around the attic, bracing myself for all the stuff I was going to have to move, I saw something up there that looked out of place. In one of the back corners, kind of tucked behind all the stuff I'd moved around, there was this box I hadn't seen before. It was black and didn't look like a flimsy cardboard box, but something sturdier, like a document box or one of those fireproof things. Despite the heavy-duty look, it somehow looked older than everything else up there. Being a curious kid and all, I obviously opened it. Inside were papers, dozens and dozens of them, like an alarming amount. Notebooks, loose pages, some hand-drawn maps, even a few pages of what looked like sheet music. And the one thing they all shared was that they were all completely covered in handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the sheet music. I started going through it, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The handwriting was difficult to decipher at first, but the more my eyes adjusted to the lettering, the more I was able to understand. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed to be stacked in chronological order, older stuff on top and newer entries near the bottom. I was so intrigued by that box and those papers that I told myself I wouldn't go back downstairs until I had read each one. The earliest entries were boring. Weather stuff, household tasks, random thoughts about the day. It kind of resembled a disorganized diary, and I was very quickly able to gather that whoever was responsible for writing it all was someone who had previously lived in that house. As I kept reading though, things got weirder. For starters, the handwriting got slightly more chaotic and illegible, which was the first indication, but that was nothing compared to the content of what I was reading. Whoever wrote all of it had become obsessed with the attic. They kept measuring it. They repeatedly documented the dimensions of the attic over and over, comparing them to the footprint of the house below. According to their math, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was space along one of the walls, like several feet, that couldn't be accounted for. They went into extreme detail about this one wall, like cracks, indents, marks. Every square inch of what made that wall distinctive was in there. The entries got even more frantic after that. Based on what I was reading, it was clear that whoever had written them was spending hours at a time in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there. They started hearing sounds from behind that missing space, like scratching, breathing, that sort of thing. There were timestamps to go along with some of the entries, like 2:14 a.m., scratching for approximately 3 minutes. The more I read, the more I realized I was getting a first-hand account of someone's complete descent into madness. There was nothing coherent about any of it, and I didn't believe what they were writing for a second, but it only got worse. The final pages weren't even sentences anymore, just tally marks, rows and rows and rows of them, counting something I couldn't identify, and then the entries just stopped. Either the person had stopped writing them, or that was as far back as the record went. By the time I got through everything, I was genuinely shaking. I wanted to put everything back where I had found it, go back downstairs, and purge the memory of ever reading it from my brain, but there was something I had to do first. My eyes went straight to the wall the writer had been so fixated on, and the moment I realized there were actually some marks in it, I started feeling sick. I examined the wall, and some of the indents and cracks seemed to line up almost exactly with what that guy had been saying. It was a type of freaky I had yet to experience. I can only describe it as the feeling of being watched, but but from multiple different angles. I could picture that guy clawing at the attic wall in a fit of lunacy. It felt like he was in there with me. Suddenly, I didn't want to spend another second in that attic. I grabbed the black box and went straight to my dad. He was just as shocked as I was. He had absolutely no idea what any of it meant, and he had definitely never seen it before. He told me he was 100% sure it wasn't his father's handwriting, which meant whoever wrote those entries must have been a person who lived there even before my grandpa. The thing was, his parents were both gone, and he knew absolutely nothing about the people who had lived in the house before them. My dad went up to investigate, and to my surprise, he took me with him. I felt a lot safer having him with me, so I didn't argue. I stood off to the side while my dad inspected the wall more meticulously than I did, using some of the pages as a guide. After a few minutes, he froze up like he was thinking. I thought he had given up, but he turned to me and told me he was going to rip the wall down. I was actually kind of shocked by that, but I was in no position to oppose him. So that's exactly what he did. He ripped that wall down with some tools from the garage, and what we saw was shocking. The writer had been right. There was a space back there, a lot of space. It was several feet deep, and it ran the whole length of the wall, but that wasn't even the worst part. The walls of the hidden space were covered in markings. Black lines, symbols, shapes I didn't even recognize. They covered almost every surface. I don't really know how to describe it, but those marks were something else entirely. They didn't look like writing. The implication was even worse than that though, because my dad and I soon realized that there was no alternative entrance to that hidden space. So how could someone have ever gotten in there in the first place? My dad and I just stood there, completely overwhelmed by what we were looking at. Eventually, once the initial shock wore off, we confirmed there was nothing else in the space, and there wasn't. The entire room was empty with the exception of whatever was drawn all over the walls. Things didn't end there. The more we thought about the situation, the less it made sense. At one point, my dad pointed out that whoever wrote those notebooks, whoever had been so obsessed with documenting every little detail, did not seem like the type of person who would so neatly organize everything in a little box and tuck it away in a corner. Compulsive behavior doesn't end with tidy archival work. That thought hadn't occurred to me until that moment, but I had to admit, he was right. But that could only mean that someone else had compiled the collection. My dad was 2 steps ahead of me. I watched as this unreadable look washed over his face. It looked like a mix of sadness and confusion. He was quiet for a little, then said it must have been his father, my grandfather. He must have found the writings at some point, gathered them together, and stored them in that box. There wasn't much to do after that. My dad admitted years later that his dad having withheld something like that from him, and why he would even do that in the first place, was something that would eat at him forever. And I don't blame him. As for me, I don't really know what to make of any of it. It happened so long ago that I don't think it matters anymore, but if I think about it for long enough, I can still freak myself out. I don't think anyone can rationalize it. There's no reasonable explanation. I used to think that whoever had written those entries was the same person who had scratched up that hidden space, and that they were probably just insane. But there were things in those pages that someone could only know after the wall was put up. But with the wall being up, there was no other way into that space. It truly makes no sense. My dad wouldn't let me keep the box when we ultimately moved out of that house. For all I know, it's still up there in that attic. All I know is this is a mystery I'll take with me to my grave. I've been a smoker for longer than I care to admit, 23 years now, give or take. At this point, it's less of a habit and more of a ritual, something to keep my hands busy or to mark the end of a day. The thing is, I refuse to smoke inside. My parents were the same way when they lived here, even though my dad smoked cigars on special occasions. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally pulled the trigger and moved down to Florida. They'd been talking about it for years, and I think they just needed to know the house would be in good hands before they could actually leave. I was divorced, living in an apartment that was way too small and depressing, so the timing worked out. My only complaint now is that the house actually feels too big, which sounds absurd until you realize it's a 3-story colonial and I live alone. The house also has this big backyard, probably close to an acre if you count the wooded part, and I've gotten into the habit of taking these late night walks out there while I smoke. It's peaceful. There aren't any neighbors close enough to bother me, and the only light out there comes from my house. So usually, it's just me and the crickets and whatever's rustling around in the trees. I usually do a full loop around the property line, which takes about 10 minutes if I'm not rushing. It's become my version of meditation, I guess. Or maybe just my excuse to smoke in peace. There is one thing that needs to be known about the house. The house itself is incredibly old. It has the creaky floors, drafty windows, all of that stuff. It's practically impossible to walk around in there without making noise. It also has an attic, which is accessed through this pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's essentially a big storage room, and I only go up there when I need to grab decorations or store some of my parents' stuff that I don't know what to do with, but I don't want to throw away. There's a tiny little window up there too, which overlooks the backyard. It's maybe a foot wide, original to the house, and it kind of looks out of place against the rest of the house. I've looked up at that window hundreds of times during my walks. It's never caught my attention before. That is, until about 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual loop, halfway through a cigarette, when I happened to glance up at the house. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking about the attic or anything. My eyes just drifted upward, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind that little window. I stopped walking and just stood there in the middle of the backyard, staring up at the attic. The window was dark, obviously. There's no light up there unless you bring a flashlight, but I was almost positive I'd seen movement. A shape passing in front of the glass maybe, or something shifting in the darkness behind it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'd probably just seen a reflection of a cloud or a bat flying past or something. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and didn't think about it again. The next night, though, I saw it again. This time I was sure there was definitely something moving up there beyond just a reflection or a trick of the light. Something was in my attic. My first thought was that it was an animal. Squirrels get into old houses all the time, and I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a gap somewhere in the eaves. But then I started thinking about what kind of animal would be big enough to see from that distance, and I didn't like any of the answers I came up with. I went back inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the hallway where the attic access is. I didn't hear any scratching or scurrying. I actually didn't hear anything for that matter, which didn't make sense. I really didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. If something was in my attic, I needed to know about it. So reluctantly, I turned on my phone flashlight and pulled down the ladder. It was especially nerve-wracking because the layout of the attic meant I'd have to go up blindly. If there was something lurking just beyond the opening, I wouldn't be able to see it. I climbed up slowly, trying to convince myself I wasn't scared out of my mind. But I was, and my fears were almost immediately justified. I was not prepared for what I saw up there. It wasn't an animal that was up there. It wasn't a person either. The attic was a complete disaster. I don't mean messy, I mean destroyed. Everything was in complete disarray. There wasn't a box or bin unturned, but I wasn't thinking about any of that. All I could think about was the black paint, or at least what looked like black paint that was smeared across every wall up there, including the ceiling. It was disturbingly thick, almost chunky, but the worst part by far was how wet it looked, as if it had been smeared only moments earlier. It was still dripping in some places, so I was 100% sure it was fresh. That initial glimpse freaked me out so much that I genuinely almost fell off the ladder. I don't know why, but seeing that dripping paint terrified me to the point that I felt like I couldn't breathe. My brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Some freak was in my house. I did one quick sweep of the attic with my flashlight to make sure there was no one in there, and that was it for me. I practically fell down the ladder in my rush to get back to the second floor. In a matter of seconds, my fear became anger. I was going to find this person, and I was going to defend myself. I started tearing through the house, checking every room, but I didn't find anything. And the more I looked, the more discouraged I got. The adrenaline was also starting to wear off, and I was becoming much more afraid again, which didn't help matters at all. I cleared the house and went back upstairs to my bedroom, thinking maybe I had missed something. But even after checking the whole room again, I didn't find anything. The moment I paused to take a breather, though, I heard something. 2 thumps, then what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sounds were coming from directly above me, which could have only meant one thing. The attic. How stupid of me. Whoever was up there had probably never even left. They had probably been hiding behind one of the overturned storage boxes. I don't know where the courage came from, but something in me snapped. This was my parents' house. and whoever was up there violated it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and you best believe I was ready to use it. I went back upstairs and pulled the ladder down again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the rungs, but I forced myself to keep climbing. And then I just started screaming like a full-on lunatic. I burst through the attic opening, yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the knife around like some kind of maniac. Part of it was anger, but honestly most of it was fear. I stomped around the attic as aggressively as I could, flipping boxes and screaming the whole time, but there was no one up there. I was sure about it this time. My attic isn't that big. It's just one big space, so there's quite literally nowhere to hide. There was something up there though, something new. Seeing it killed every ounce of bravery I had managed to scrape together. There were scratch marks everywhere. Long, deep gouges in the wooden beams and floorboards like an animal had been clawing at them. The paint from before was still there, but the scratches were layered over everything, and after seeing that, I was done. I ran back down to the first floor bathroom, locked myself in there, and called 911. The police arrived maybe 15 minutes later. 2 officers went up to check the attic while I was waiting downstairs with the third one. When they finally came back down, all they could tell me was the attic was empty. They also told me they couldn't find any gaps anywhere up there. So whoever had vandalized my property and terrified me must have left through the house. I insisted that their explanation was impossible. I would have heard them leave. Like I said before, the house is incredibly creaky, so even the slightest step is enough to make a sound that I would have heard, even from a floor down. But there was nothing else the officers could do, and nothing else they could tell me, so they left. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and luckily there haven't been any further incidents. So I guess I have no choice but to believe that some homeless person snuck into my attic, vandalized it for whatever reason, and left without me noticing. But the problem is, I don't believe that. I really don't know what to make of all of this, but I refuse to believe that some homeless person caused all of it. It's something worse than that. I still haven't been back up there, even to clean the paint. I really don't know what to do.